Hey fam, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications.
Speaking of Florida, their amendment down in the state of Florida, Amendment 4, which restored voting rights to 1.4 million formerly incarcerated felons, is still under attack by Republican legislators there. Even though the amendment to the Florida Constitution was specifically written to keep the legislature out of implementation, the measure there passed with 64.5% of the vote. Now, for some good news. The Florida Senate committee working on implementation is not demanding that all fines and court costs be paid before voting rights are restored. However, their Florida House committee there that is working on it is demanding that payment. Those payments could total billions of dollars, and so some progress here, but the fight is not over in Florida. On the federal level, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland introduced the Democracy Restoration Act of 2019 this week. The bill will restore federal voting rights to all Americans with felony convictions as soon as they're released from prison. Here to talk about that with us is Connor Maxwell, Race and Ethnicity Policy Analyst at the Center for American Progress. Connor, thank you so much for joining us. Sorry I'm here instead of Roland. I'm sure you're probably looking forward to it, but I hope we have the good conversation nonetheless. What does the senator's bill ultimately do for so many formerly incarcerated citizens?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And I think the right place to start is Senator Cardin's bill would solve exactly the sorts of problems that we're seeing coming out of Florida, right? Beginning with carve-outs. In Amendment 4, there were specific carve-outs for offenses, and there was a lack of clarity or a perceived lack of clarity from Governor DeSantis about how it should be implemented. And he took advantage of that situation in order to disenfranchise as many people, black people, as he possibly could. So Senator Cardin's bill would restore voting rights to vote in federal elections to anyone with a prior felony conviction immediately upon release from prison. And that's really important because this is, we all know research shows voting is an important tool for reentry. It's supported by law enforcement. The American Probation and Parole Association is extremely supportive of this bill and of restoring voting rights. So it's the right step forward. More than 10 senators already support it.
We already know that voter suppression is huge. It played a huge role in 2016, and we expect that it'll play a huge role moving forward. What degree of optimism should any of us have that other Republicans who sign on, both on the state level and federal level, for different degrees of voter suppression, what degree of optimism should we have that they'll then be supportive of this legislation?
Sure. Well, I always try and stay optimistic. But what I'll say is that voter restoration is supported by Democrats and Republicans. And we saw that in Florida this year. 65% of voters supported this, over 3 million votes cast in support. And so you do see bipartisan support. You saw the ACLU and the Koch brothers coming together in Florida to get this thing done. What you're seeing is a cadre of far-right lawmakers in the Florida legislature disregarding the will of their own constituents and moving forward in order to suppress voters and keep their own seats. That's exactly what we're seeing here. That's disappointing, but I think as a whole, we're moving forward in the right direction.
What are some next steps that we need to see in order to see this bill introduced by the senator really come to fruition? And then again, it has to be signed by Donald Trump. What optimism do we have of that? Even the most optimistic person like yourself.
Yeah. Well, what's nice is that there are 14 states across the country that already restore voting rights to people immediately upon release from prison. I'm hopeful that all the senators from those states will get behind this bill, and then we'll go talk to the president and explain to him why this is so essential for our democracy. Because quite frankly, in the United States of America, a U.S. citizen's voting rights should not depend on the state in which they reside.
That's a great point. I'm going to turn to our panel here. And Scott, I want to get your thoughts on this conversation we're having with Connor.
As you listen to this story to the viewing audience, the history of taking away the vote of a felon is rooted in Jim Crow era and in the South, right? And it was historical to keep people of color, freed slaves and the majority of African Americans who lived in the South at that time and still do, to not be able to vote so that the Republicans or Democrats, white men, could get reelected. It's 2019 right now. Does that sound familiar? And so there's really no real basis. There's no relationship between whether I've been convicted of a felon and whether I have a right to vote, if you think about it. There's none. Name me the top 3 reasons, legitimate reasons, why I should not vote because I committed a felony or a crime. There really isn't. I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm a second-class citizen if I can't vote. If I did my time already and I'm out, right? I can't vote while you're in prison. It'd be too impractical. But now that I'm out, okay, now that I'm out, why can't I vote? And so many states, something like 35, maybe more, still have, including Washington, D.C., although I think I think it's, I may be wrong about that. They under certain circumstances, the individuals who have been away can come back and can vote. Can vote under certain circumstances. But remember, the bottom line is there's no causal connection, no logical connection between whether you committed a crime and get out and your right to vote. It's illogical.
Joanna, we were talking about this question of voting, and voter suppression even comes up again because as optimistic as Connor is, and he's rightful to be so, right? Mm-hmm. I really have a hard time seeing the overwhelming efforts in North Carolina, seeing the overwhelming efforts in Florida, the overwhelming efforts in Wisconsin, those states that helped decide the 2016 election for the president. For me to now think that there's going to be a kumbaya moment where people come together and want to give retroactive voting rights to those who are formerly incarcerated. Where do you fall, and where does your analysis of voter suppression lead you to think this will end up?
Very good question. As my co-panelists, both of them have said, voting is a fundamental right? Because if you don't have a choice to vote, you can't voice your concerns. You can't voice your issues, right? But we live in a society where, unfortunately, as optimistic as I would like to be, but do we really think we're moving in a direction where the U.S. government will allow people who have committed crimes to give them back the right to vote, right? Do we really think we're in that place in America? I would like to say some states we are in that place, but as a country as a whole, I don't think we are, because the reality, the fact of the matter is, if every person in America were to vote, we would never have a Republican in office, right? So vote suppression, we would never have a Republican in office. That's just the reality of it.
I'm not so sure about that.
You would disagree?
Yeah. Well, and if again, I'm going to pause for a second and come to Kelly for a second. And the reason why I would say that is because we just talked earlier about the Southern strategy. And there are a number of folks who see that anything that government does benefits black people, and now that conversation has expanded to people of color and immigrants of the sort. And so there are a number of people who are willing to cut off their own metaphorical nose to spite their face. And I know that's probably something you want to respond to, but I want to get to Kelly. I promise I'll come back to you. Kelly, we're talking about this question of voter suppression, and we're beating up on poor Connor by lambasting the idea of being optimistic. Right. But what's your read on it? Are you hopeful that something good can come of this?
I mean, naturally, I'm an optimistic person. Realistically, I understand that we are in a Trump administration presidency. So
2021.
Hey.
2021.
January 2021.
I'm keeping hope alive. However, and I had a conversation with some colleagues about this earlier, whether Trump is going to win in 2020 is up for debate as well. So, my thoughts on that later. But regarding specifically voting rights for, former felons, I think it has to tie in with the prison reform as a whole, right? Because you have to think about, we're trying to rehabilitate that as well. So this is a component of that, because like my co-panelists were saying, they're second-class citizens until they get their right to vote back. And honestly, we don't know whether they're going to vote Democrat if they get their rights back anyway.
Right. There's no presumption of that. Give me 1 second, Scott, before we go there. Connor, I want to come back to you. Yeah. Let's get inside the weeds of this for just 1 second. Although Senator Cardin has introduced this legislation, and you talked about the various states that already have something on the books that are akin to it, where are the committees that this is going to have to go through? Who are the senators on that committee that folks need to be paying attention to?
Sure. So this bill will go through the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is led by Senator Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham has sort of gone off the rails.
Well, there it is.
And there goes our optimism.
In the past, he has supported some reforms, and hopefully we can get a hearing on this and we can talk through these issues. Because as some of your panelists have said, disenfranchising people for crimes they committed in the past, there's no basis for that. There's no reason for that. There's no public safety reason for that. And these people are eligible to pay federal taxes. They should be eligible to vote in federal elections. So your panelists are absolutely right. The odds are steep, and perhaps this won't be accomplished this Congress or even the next Congress. But I think in general, we're moving in the right direction on this issue of voter restoration.
There's a group in the House called the Justice Dems. Is there anyone out of that organization, that group of congresspersons that are carrying the water on this particular legislation on the House side?
So that's a fascinating question, and some of your viewers might be interested to know this. While this bill does exist as a standalone, and it's held by, it's been introduced by Chairman Gerald Nadler, who's the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. This provision actually already passed the House of Representatives. It was folded into H.R. 1, the For the People Act, and so it already passed. Every single Democratic member voted for this policy and is supportive of it. And so we're hoping that our counterparts in the Senate will be able to get this done.
Scott, you had to chime in.
Real quick. So here's a reason. Here are two reasons to be optimistic. You're right. It may not be this Congress. It may be the next Congress. The Senate in 2020, several seats are up, and many pollsters and political analysts believe that the Dems have a real shot at taking over the Senate and holding the House. That's one thing. Second of all, depending on the demographics, depending on the reports that you see and the Pew Trust analysis and foundation reports, people of color are going to be the majority of this country, whether it's 10 years or 20 years from now. I got to believe that those people who have suffered because of this litmus test, if you will, for voting are going to come out in strong support of it and look for the demographics and look for the people, the change in the Senate and the House to become more diverse. And when you get that diversity, short-term, long-term, then this issue bubbles to the top and has a tremendous chance of passing. It's the right thing to do.
I'll remind Roland in some years after now that Johanna and Scott both gave the James Carville prediction that 50 years in the wilderness for Republicans, because Democrats will be the ones that'll be moving on.
I dream about it. I'm sorry.
Connor, we thank you so much. Is there anything real quick before you get out of here, anything folks can do to help push this along, any kind of contact to their legislatures that you would advocate for?
So what I'll say is educate as many people as you know about this issue. A lot of folks don't realize that their neighbors, their cousins, aren't allowed to vote because of something that they were convicted of in the past. And so public education is the most important part of this. Obviously, democracy is key here. Voting, contacting your lawmakers, and making it clear that voting is a fundamental right in this country, and they need to stand up for it.
Absolutely. Connor, thank you so much for your time and attention on this. We'll be sure to pay attention, and I'm sure that when Roland comes back, he'll be all over this.
All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment.
Calling all HBCU alumni. That's me, Scott, and I know you're one as well. Yeah, all the HBCU alumni in the house. Yeah, we're deep in here today. Calling all the HBCU alumni, students, and leaders. Enter the Ford Motor Company HBCU Mobility Challenge and win $25,000 for your school. Building on their long-term support of HBCUs, Ford is looking to improve mobility in HBCU communities through innovative solutions. The winning program will receive a grant of up to $25,000 to implement their proposal. The deadline to apply has been extended to April 15th, 2019, tax day. Get the Ford application in and your taxes at the same time. Go to fgb.life. Again, F as in Frank, G as in girl, B as in boy, .life for more info. And to apply, Ford goes further in our community.
Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.